Welcome to this VBACE education session, Buying a Private Aircraft, What First-Time Buyers Need to Know. My name is Mike Nichols, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Innovation at the National Business Aviation Association. During my tenure at NBAA, I've enjoyed creating programming on a variety of topics, including best practices for aircraft transactions. I am joined today by two leading experts in aviation transactions who will be our panelists as we talk about how to approach buying your first airplane, whether it's a fractional share of an airplane or a whole aircraft. Amanda Applegate is a partner in Aerlex Law Group, a Los Angeles-based firm that represents domestic and international clients in aviation and business law. Amanda specializes in aircraft transactions and has successfully closed hundreds of sales and purchases for all types of business aircraft around the world. Prior to joining Aerlex, she served as Associate General Counsel and Vice President of NetJet Services, Inc., the company that pioneered fractional jet ownership. Deborah Bulu founded Aircraft Acquisitions, Inc. in Durham, North Carolina in 1990 and primarily works on the acquisition of high-quality jet aircraft globally. Deborah provides a comprehensive project view of the acquisition or sale, interweaving the ownership structure, tax implications, and dealing points focusing on the details important to a client. Deborah is a frequent speaker on the subject of aircraft transactions and served as the chair of the NBA Tax Committee. Purchasing an airplane, as with all other large capital expenditures, has a level of complexity that creates opportunities, yet may present some pitfalls. To explain the process and set you up for a successful transaction, we will focus on 6 key themes related to buying an airplane. The first theme, buying an airplane is a team sport. Buyers have a tendency to assemble their team piecemeal, and too often the entire team is brought together towards the end of the deal. Putting your team together early in the process will make you a more prepared buyer. First, let's discuss who should be on the team.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's a very complicated thing buying an aircraft. And so when we think about bringing the team together, we want to have experts in all areas. I don't know of one person in the industry who could do all the jobs necessary on the team. And there's lots of things that I understand in the industry, but things technical, for example, I would need to bring in someone. So when we assemble the team, first and foremost, we need a buyer broker consultant, somebody who can help look at the utilization pattern of the client and figure out what the best aircraft is for that client. Then once they establish the best aircraft, look at all of the aircraft on the market and source the best aircraft at the right price with the best pedigree. Then second on the team is an aviation attorney and tax consultant. Now this could be the same person, or it could be multiple people from the same firm, or it could be 2 people from 2 different organizations. But you're going to need somebody who understands how the transaction flow goes when you buy an aircraft, and very importantly, you need to understand the tax benefits and consequences of owning the aircraft. Then also on the team, if you're going to be financing, you'll need to engage a lender early on in the process so that the lender has enough time to underwrite the deal prior to the plane being ready for closing. And then, of course, when you're in pre-buy with the aircraft, and you need someone with technical expertise who can oversee that pre-buy. And I can tell you from experience, the amount of money you're going to pay that technical representative to be at the inspection facility for you will be far outweighed by the benefits you'll receive from having someone on site overseeing that inspection, who's your eyes and ears on the ground. And then finally, once all of the matters come together and you're ready for closing, you'll need an escrow agent in Oklahoma City, which is where the FAA registry is. And there's actually a filing window that you go up to with the closing documents, and you file and file the bill of sale and the new registration application for the new owner. So, putting together that team is important. And the team members not only need to come together, but they need to understand who the quarterback of that team is. So I always like to be the quarterback if I happen to be on the team, but I like to make sure that there's someone on the team who does have that quarterback role, who's overseeing and making sure that each person on the team is completing their tasks and responsibilities. So, again, it's not about assembling the team that is right for your friend, but more about assembling the team that's right for the particular aircraft you're sourcing. So there are brokers, for example, who specialize in certain aircraft types, and that might not be the broker that you want if you're getting a different aircraft type from that. So each individual person has their own unique skill set, and bringing the right team together can make the transaction so much easier.
Great, thank you very much, Amanda. Our next theme is define your mission profile. Deborah?
Yes, so what we like to do is make sure that clients are focusing on what you want the airplane to do for you. That helps you narrow options, and it also excludes aircraft that won't help you achieve, whatever your transportation needs are. And it's often surprising, but different airplanes have different features, and the trick is really to match the model type to your particular needs. So we start with a mission profile analysis and consider the factors such as where do you need to go, how often, how many passengers. And so at Aircraft Acquisitions, we start with the 10 top city pairs to analyze. We look at what airports are available for that city. Do they have appropriate runway links and services, even ramp loading requirements, depending on the weight of the airplane. So we find that sometimes it's surprising that bigger isn't always better. Instead, we're looking at a smart fit and really using often the 80-20 rule, as that fits nicely. So after where do you need to go, we look at how often. Setting a frequency to each destination helps develop both the hours for the budget simulation that you will be using, but also indicates patterns of use for the team to consider. So including the typical use, but also highlighting any outliers that you may need to consider for one airplane over another. And then you need to weigh the importance of those outliers. For instance, we don't recommend you buy an airplane with a range for Hawaii when you only go once a year. I mean, there are other alternatives for that one time. And so you're looking at a balance when you're looking at the frequency. Other considerations come into view like temperature, elevation considerations. Of course, Aspen is notorious for having a combination of both. We want to look at how many passengers. You want to estimate a typical passenger load by city pair rather than just generally, I normally take 2 or 4 passengers. Many airplanes have the seats, but you may not be able to fill those seats and go the full range of the airplane, especially if you're looking at westbound in the wintertime, things like that. You also want to look at catering and servicing requirements. It is different when you have 8 passengers than, of course, just 1 or 2. So all in all, you're developing a clearer picture of what you might be able to use this tool for. Maybe adding a new travel area, also identifying possible limitations. Also the duration of trips. A Monday to Friday, 8 to 6 p.m. domestic operation is different from a weekend or personal operation. So, you want it. It will be helpful to look at what that view is and then what the deadhead leg estimates might be. So deadheads are legs with no passengers. And of course, you want to include that in your budget hours when we get to that point. It also may drive an unexpected view towards fractional because deadhead travel especially makes fractional look especially good. We want to look at business or personal flying. You want to start out with city pairs to be able to look at both how you're going to view the operation, but also you're starting a model for your attorneys onto business hours versus personal use hours. And that pretends how this whole process fits into an IRS business use test analysis, which in turn also helps the aviation attorneys. Other considerations with the mission profile, some of the operational elements become clear, such as, is there excess capacity available for thoughts like, I want supplemental 135 usage, or maybe a partnership. Do you actually have the usage available? Also, when we're doing a comprehensive simulation, your team will help develop how many persons will be required to support the operation. Are you 100 hours or 400 hours? And then whether a management company's ability to support a different additional lift might be beneficial, or indicate a maintenance solution that might be better to fit your particular operation. So all in all, it's important to understand that one aircraft type will likely not meet 100% of your travel needs. And there may be some specific flights that are served by other options, including the airlines or chartering a different aircraft. So for example, if 90% of your flying is 2 people going less than 1,000 miles, and you anticipate one trip annually to Europe, just like the Hawaii example for 6 people, you may want to focus on aircraft options that fit that 80 or 90% and your needs. Yeah.
And Deborah, isn't that because a lot of clients just don't have one solution anymore? It seems to me I'm encountering more and more people who have a little bit of everything. Maybe they have a membership card and a fractional and their own plane, and it seems like they are able to, look at a lot of different things these days.
Yeah, we're especially, there's so many hybrid options and flexible options, so you can really get what you need. And sometimes it's really driven by the personal versus the business and how you treat the business in that way, but also just simply because the needs are different. Flying across country is nonstop is a very different answer than someone who needs to stop all the way along to see different business.
Right. I like how you call it the 80-20 rule, right? Because you might be able to find the right source for 80%, but still dabble in different markets for the other 20% that you need.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
A couple of years ago, NBAA's tax committee had done an analysis of aircraft options, which resulted in rules of thumb guidance. Suggested that for less than 50 hours per year, charter can be the best option. Between 50 and 200 hours a year, fractional ownership is the best option. And over 200 hours per year, whole aircraft ownership is the best option. And while that rules of thumb may be appropriate and applicable, as we're just talking about, there are other considerations and other factors. Amanda, could you go into a little bit of detail on that?
Yeah, it's funny timing because right before this call, I had a call with a client, and we had all these spreadsheets up, and we were looking at all of the analysis, and finally I said, high level, what is it? And he said, well, I like this because of this plane, I like this because of this plane, and I'd rather do this. And it really wasn't about what the all-in hourly cost option was, but there were a lot of emotional factors that came into the conversation. And I think it's important when we are advising buyers on aircraft to not just get stuck in the dollars and cents analysis, but really make sure that you're exploring what the emotional components to the decision are. So, for example, I have clients who would never consider chartering their whole aircraft because they don't want anybody else on their aircraft. Whereas other clients say charter it as much as you can and run it as often as you can. And so those are the type of factors that you can't do by just looking at the spreadsheets. You need to really draw in from everything that you know about the particular client and really try to pull out as much information as you can. So while those rules of thumb are helpful, I certainly have clients that fly over 400 years, all fractional, and I certainly have clients who fly under 10 hours a year who own their whole aircraft. As crazy as that may seem to me, that's what they want to do, and we need to support whatever decision that they make as buyers.
That's right, thanks. And that's a perfect segue into our next concept, know your options. In this panel discussion today, we're focusing on 2 primary options, fractional ownership and whole aircraft ownership. Examples of other options include membership programs, chartering an airplane, co-owning an aircraft, and joint ownership. Your aircraft team can advise you on these options if they are relevant for your mission. Amanda, what is fractional ownership and what are the advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, so fractional ownership has been around for I think over 30 years now, and it definitely has a place in the market, just like whole aircraft. And it's the perfect fit for a lot of my clients and a lot of people throughout the world. And fractional ownership basically is, just as it says, you're buying a fraction of an aircraft. And so you are an owner of an aircraft, just like you would be of a whole aircraft. So you can treat it just like you would for tax purposes as owning a whole aircraft. And then you have a management company, the fractional company themselves, who will do a lot of the things for you. So basically, as a fractional owner, you'll have a personalized 1-800 number to call in on. Someone will pick up the phone, usually the same 3 or 4 people, so you can get to know them. And you can give them your itinerary, and they'll handle everything for you at a fixed cost. So from a budgeting perspective, you will know your fixed cost over the next 5 years to the exact penny, as long as you use all the hours you're entitled to use under your program. And you'll really have sort of this one-stop shop experience with a fractional program, which for a lot of my clients, it's perfect. The other thing about fractional is they have a lot of aircraft that are interchangeable. So, if there is a aircraft on the ground issue or weather, something like that, there is a good recovery that can take place from a fractional program that, may be more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult if you have your own aircraft. So those distinguishing factors, even though the price point per hour can be more than whole aircraft, really have helped supported this industry for the last 30 years. And I can see that continuing on, particularly for people who don't want to have as much capital invested up front as you would, paying the full purchase price for 100% of an aircraft when you can just get a 6.25% or 50 hours a year from a fractional program.
Great, thank you. And Deborah, what are the advantages and disadvantages of whole aircraft ownership?
Yeah, so when we're looking at whole aircraft ownership in this particular context, we're not buying a program, we're buying a tool. So therefore, you have a lot more flexibility as to how that tool is being used, and you have more control in the cost management, more tailoring to your schedule, more connectedness, to your personnel and their responsiveness. If you've left your briefcase on board, or if you need to add a trip destination, all of that is really at your disposal. So in whole ownership, you may see the flight operation really as an extension of the company's success, furthering of its profitability, of its success in ways that are more like a team, like your football team or your hockey team. During coronavirus, many flight operations have been put to use, playing key roles in the company operations for things like safety and travel protocols, and that interaction of the expertise that you have at both levels. The disadvantage is when a significant change occurs, it's not just a program contract that you're trying to renegotiate, but you're working with a full-on committed support operation, and that could be less easy to change when things come up. Okay.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And with a fractional aircraft, the program manager manages the day-to-day responsibilities that support the aircraft operation, including scheduling, crew, maintenance, and all the other logistics. What options are available for someone who purchases a whole aircraft, Deborah?
Yeah, so there are really two main options and levels of involvement that you're going to want to consider as an owner. So we're really talking about matching your style. I like to use with clients, are you one to manage your own money? Or do you hand your money off to a money manager? And then secondly, if you do hand it off, do you want to influence some of the choices that money manager makes? In the flight operation, typically you manage your own money. You hire in key personnel within your group and to manage your money, and then you have your own flight department. Your management then instead becomes sort of hiring a chief pilot or an aviation manager who's responsible to ensure your style of management or your company culture. When you use a management company, the management companies usually come in actually two versions, large and then small. And so if you tend to delegate your money management, again, to larger outside managers who have lots of expertise, then that large management company might also be your option. The larger the management company, also the more set their policies are. So you're, again, back to this concept of, in some ways, buying a program. Similar to how a money fund operates, they may be able to afford you larger volume discounts and benefits by nature that, you can't do on your own. The smaller management companies tend to have more ability to craft services. So they tend to even look like the flight operation in many ways. And they may be able to, effectively look like your flight operation, but you're actually outsourcing the payroll or specific personnel costs under that other entity. But under both versions, you're outsourcing to another company versus having your own control. So it's a question of matching your company or personal style. Today, there are many viable options and hybrids, as we talked about earlier. So spending a little time fitting to your business style to that flight operation will go a long way to being happier later.
Deborah, is one of the key factors in that if you're planning to charter your aircraft or not, as far as, what you would select in that decision tree?
Yeah, good. So most management companies, not all, but some are Part 135 management companies, but an awful lot of them have now gone under the 135 rules, which allows you that flexibility to go ahead and put your own airplane, outsourcing that for charter too. Yeah, good. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And that's that reference to 135 is another great segue, because we're going to talk now about planning an optimal ownership and operational structure. And aviation is a highly regulated industry. There are a number of federal agencies that aircraft owners need to be aware of and need to ensure compliance with their regulations. We'll introduce some regulatory considerations, and your team will have to address those details with you as you plan your acquisition. So Amanda, some folks participating in this webinar might not have ever heard of 135 before, and we've used it a couple times. So let's start with a brief introduction to FAA and tax considerations.
Sure, and it really tailors into when you think of bringing in the right team. So sometimes, if you rely on your general counsel and try to buy an aircraft, they might not understand the nuances of the federal aviation regulations. And they might set up a perfect structure that makes a whole lot of sense from a tax perspective, but actually violates the FAA regulations and could put you into some regulatory issues if you don't have the right structure. So sometimes the IRS and the FARs don't necessarily match up. And so it's about finding the best solution within both sets, both in the code and the regulations. So, high level, when you're thinking about aircraft utilization, if you own your own aircraft, you can fly under Part 91, which basically means it's owner operated. And as it should be, these are flights that aren't receiving any compensation for hire, and therefore they're the least stringent of the set of regulations. Then if you go up the scale, the next one would be 91K, which governs fractional ownership. So under fractional ownership, a lot of the operational considerations and rules are similar to 135, because you've got these large management companies, large fractional providers who are offering this service, but yet it's still the owner's aircraft and they are still in operational control. So then finally you come to Part 135, which has more stringent regulations, because this is where you're paying someone for their services of using an aircraft. And so it's commercial charter. And as a result, you have more limitations on crew duty time, length of runway, on-site weather reporting, those sorts of things. So it's kind of a graduated scale, as it should be. The more regulations applied to, the more people who are getting on board without the knowledge necessary to fly the plane, right? You're paying someone for their expertise to fly you around, and there are stricter regulations that result from that.
Great, thanks. And can you cover some of the tax considerations at a high level?
Sure. So again, and this applies both for fractional ownership and whole aircraft ownership, because under the code they're treated the same. So when you think about buying an aircraft, you need to think about both the federal tax considerations. We hear all sorts of buzzwords in the industry like bonus depreciation, and everyone gets excited that they can write off 100% of their aircraft, right? That may not always be the case. And I think we have a full session on that this year at VBACE. I think Angel Hudak and Julianne Christensen are speaking on that topic. So it might be good to tune into that if you want a more in-depth analysis about tax considerations at the federal level. But it is an absolute must to consider before you buy an aircraft, because once you buy it and put your structure in place, there's not an undo or a redo button. So you need to have the right tax structure in place, and making sure that when you say this is going to be 100% for business use, that you understand that means that everybody on the plane, or at least the larger percentage of the people on the aircraft, need to be flying for business purposes. And then not only do you need the federal tax considerations, but you also need to look at the state tax considerations. And when I say state tax, I mean the state in which you're going to close the transaction in. Where's the plane going to be physically located at the time of the sale? Then also you need to look at the state in which the aircraft is going to be based out of. Where is it going to be hangared? What are the state tax treatments for aircraft ownership in that state? And then finally, any states you're going to visit often enough to be noticed by that state. What are their rules and regulations? And oftentimes there are exemptions to paying use tax in certain states. So you can minimize your use tax exposure in those states, but it will really often tailor into your ownership structure. So if you don't do your ownership structure right and you buy the aircraft, then backing into one of the exemptions in the state is nearly impossible. So that's why putting together the team early and having that ownership structure and tax plan in place prior to acquisition is so important.
Right. So this is again where a good project manager really steps in, because it's all about communicating and signposting, because your technical people are not going to necessarily have, without that signposting, talked with your attorney. So when you put together an LOI or you put together the contract, if you pull your whole team together, they allow for both identification of decisions that need to be made, but also try to understand what's most important in this. So it's one thing to create a plan, but it's another to ensure compliance. And then the next side is that periodic review throughout the process. So, when it's the first purchase, there's a lot of new concepts to, work with Amanda about and try to understand, okay, what did you mean by IRS? What did you mean by the tax as you go through it? And, you want to make sure you're setting milestones so that that project is on track, and that you bring back in the same people to make sure that in each of the things you discussed on the front end is actually going to be put into place.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, there needs to be like a trickle down from the team, meaning that, the key team member might be, some, like the CFO of a company may be on the team, right? But he's not necessarily going to be the person handling the state tax filings or collecting and remitting use tax if it's necessary in your particular state. So sometimes we can put this really great plan together at the acquisition point, and then a couple months later I'll get an email and be like, oh, are we supposed to be remitting tax somewhere, type of thing, right? So it's just really important that once the closing occurs, that there is that final distribution of tasks to anybody who's going to be involved in the implementation of that plan.
Right. I love the RACI model. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, right? And then, of course,
right,
as you're putting it, who's informed? This is now your job in the end, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So once you figure out your ownership structure, then it's time to think about detailed budget planning. So our theme number 5 is, how much does it cost?
Yeah, so I'll pick that up. So budgeting, we all want to know how much things cost, and we start with a budget, and we have this idea that it's a budget. But really, I think it's best to think about this as a simulation. Really, we're really comparing things. We're comparing pieces of information so that we can look at the nuances between, in the beginning, models themselves, and then how those models might be applied against your mission profile. So a typical budget does have some standard components to them. We often look at variable cost, being the costs that occur when you fly the airplane. Examples of that are fuel burns. The fuel burns are different by each model. So you want to look at, you don't want to just presume 200 hours is 200 hours. So the annual hours do change depending on how fast the airplane goes. The maintenance cost is in the variable cost. That is typically seen on an hourly basis. But if you start to compare the two, it starts to provide clues about how much maintenance each model type needs over a period of time. Some are weighted by calendar, or some have more weighting by hours. So you want to also think about how long your period of time for ownership is, because some of these inspections are 3-year inspections. So you go along with lots of low costs, and then, oops, you get hit with an inspection later. So you want to factor that all in. So with variable, you also have fixed costs. So the costs that occur when you do not fly, such things as annualized subscriptions. You have to, have the airplane at ready, even though you may not be flying it this week. Flight training costs, salaries, taxes, back to Amanda. all come in as our fixed costs. Some of the other things that you may want to add as budget inclusions, I always like future residual value. That's a cost to the overall airplane cost. Financing or costs of funds if you're not financing, book depreciation, and then of course credit for tax benefits. You want to demonstrate where the airplane is actually helping the company other than performing its missions. Once an aircraft model is selected, we go on and look at a new versus used analysis. So it's surprising to new buyers that airplanes are continually inspected to a very, very high degree, and they're returned to service using very strong predictive reliability programs these days. And more we're seeing real-time data coming in on the engines and other components where they can really predict where the costs are going to be in the future. So new versus used, in the end of that analysis may solely just be a preference. Back to that either emotional question or this is just the way we do things in our particular company. Beyond price, one key is the projected ownership length that I mentioned. Does that new price compare to the benefits of warranty period that you're going to use for your own operation? There are maintenance planning tools that are available to assess that value of new versus used. So some exposure can be mitigated when you're buying a used airplane by making it look like a new airplane, by front-loading inspections that you might have started fresh with if you bought a new airplane. So there's some willingness by the parties to look beyond maybe that preconceived notion of new versus used and tease out what some of the costs are going to be. I also mentioned the predictability options. There are options to secure larger expenditures in general, like power by the hour maintenance programs and engine overhaul programs that are very, very popular. And there are some interesting new software providers that actually focus on those predictive tools for costs. So, a good team is going to dig into all of that and really look at what the comparison differences are. Amanda, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you run your clients through those modelings, how often, it might say, look, the Challenger 350 is the perfect plane because you're going in and out of these difficult airports, but they've been on that plane before and they absolutely don't like it for whatever reason. I was just wondering how much of this, again, goes to that emotional decision versus the financial decision.
Right. Well, cost is only one small component. We focus on it. We focus on it both in purchase price and in how much is it going to cost by hour. But you really need to look at the entire airplane and how it fits within what you're trying to do. Sometimes a particular airplane, after you've flown it, has a little bit different aspect of noise level. You have to look at your passengers beyond some of the most common passengers to some key passengers. There are white knuckle flyers out there, and some airplanes really do handle bumps and noise levels differently. So we need to look at that and flight test them and get way beyond cost.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, this year in particular, seeing a lot more first-time buyers, I feel like, as a result of the pandemic, and perhaps people who were comfortable flying commercial are no longer comfortable doing it. And for those people who have never been on a lot of these aircraft type, you can show them pictures, but there really is that experience of being on them and the noise differential, and the windows are different, the seats. And how have you been able to accommodate that, with the restrictions and health issues going on right now?
It's not easy. It's not easy. There's a willingness to look at the particular situations, let's just say of the sellers. On the used side, the manufacturers have been able to manage it. They have been able to get the airplanes out and do some really good static, showings, et cetera, to be able to work around COVID. But generally, if you're if you're narrowed on a particular type, people are very willing to talk to you about the features that they see. And we've been doing some video things. The other day I flew to Michigan and I actually did a real-time video so they could feel like they were in the airplane flying it, including the level of noise, et cetera. So there's all sorts of new ways, like this webinar. This is
yeah, we've all had to get creative, that's for sure. But there is, I always am fearful of the client who elects to purchase an aircraft that he's never seen and never flown on. And I wonder if you share that fear.
I absolutely do. I really do think the old-fashioned demoing airplanes is the best way to see it, because people make so many presumptions on the front end, and we need to bust those assumptions everywhere we can so that they're getting exactly what they expect. But also asking a lot of questions, really teasing out what those expectations are. People tend to think that they should buy exactly what their friend did, and that's not exactly going to necessarily be the right fit.
Right.
That's exactly right. So after the pre-work is done, we talked about that's required before you even think about identifying a particular aircraft to purchase. In the spirit of what we started, buying an airplane is a team sport. Think of that pre-work as your practice sessions, and buying the airplane is the actual game. So Deborah, can you start us off talking about the timeline?
Sure. So, you're selecting a particular airplane type. And so you want to determine what features you want in that particular model, because someone has, either when you're buying new, you're selecting, or if you're buying used, somebody has selected options. Does it have pocket doors that close and give you privacy? If you're flying a lot at night, you might need those pocket doors because the crew doesn't need the light from the back of the airplane. There's all sorts of different options out there that you're going to pick to your particular operation. Once you selected a model, and then you start to move towards a particular serial number, and you establish, a satisfactory price range for that serial number. So you might have decided to buy an airplane without an engine program, and then you add it. So you discount the airplane on the front end, and then you end up equal after you've added back the program what your expectation was. You want to then negotiate. In order to do that, you really need to communicate the expectations across the team as to what you're now buying. So after identifying those elements which are crucial that you looked at, you're going to look at which elements are ancillary to the deal, and talk with the whole team about that, so that as you go through the negotiations, they're appropriate to that particular aircraft and this deal that you're going after. Some of the elements are timing, risk mitigation concepts need to be explained on the front end. You have qualitative elements that are important to you. You go into the airplane purchase thinking that everybody has the same level of quality. You may learn that people do things a different way. How are you going to handle that? And then you also want to focus on the deal costs. And the more of that you can do on the front end, the better, the less surprises. Once you've, established the airplane, gone ahead and communicated all that, everybody's on the same team, you've done the negotiation, you're going to put all of that into the contract, right? And you want that contract really to reflect the negotiation above. You don't want to get in later and realize that your due diligence that you're trying to do is separate and different than what Amanda negotiated for you as part of that contract. You want to pick the maintenance facility and select a facility that has the model expertise. At the end of the year, you want to make sure that facility also has the time to do the job, because you may put in void times at the end for things needing to be done by a certain time. If the facility cannot really get you there, then you need to think about a different facility. There might be other services that you may need by a facility. You want to put that into the mix. For instance, maybe it's a carpet that you wanted to change, or you may need to upgrade to the Wi-Fi system. So again, matching the facility to the intent that you have for the purchase and making sure that that all gets embedded in the contract is very, very important. All before closing.
All before closing. And Amanda, can you outline the closing process, what to expect there?
Yeah, so, like Deborah said, it'll sort of flow from the letter of intent into a purchase agreement. Once the purchase agreement is signed, the plane is moved into pre-buy. Hopefully everything goes well there, and we've got our tech rep from our team overseeing that and being our advocate. And then once we're ready for closing, we'll want to make sure the aircraft is in a good closing location, so that may or may not be the inspection facility, so the aircraft may need to be physically moved. And if everybody on the team has done their job well, then the actual closing event should be sort of what I call a non-event, right? We've worked hard in advance to make sure that all of the closing documents necessary are in Oklahoma City with the escrow agent. We've worked hard to make sure that the lender is ready to fund on the closing date. We've worked hard with our insurance broker to make sure the insurance is bound on the aircraft by the closing date. We've worked hard with our, management company, if we're using one, to negotiate the management agreement with that management company so that that is in place prior to closing. So it's all about, working during the pre-buy of the aircraft and making sure that all of the tasks on the team get done and that the quarterback is overseeing that. So then, at closing, we'll either have an email exchange or a telephone conference with the escrow agent. And, my goal is for that always to be less than 10 minutes, right? We've done all of the work up front, and the closing is just merely, yes, the plane is where it needs to be in the condition it needs to be in. And yes, the money is in escrow. We agree to release documents and money, and we close. But it's all of the work in advance of that hour on the closing day that is important, so that is a successful closing and not some sort of nightmare you never forget. So.
Great, thank you. One final question for each of you. What are common mistakes you see first-time buyers make? Deborah, we'll start with you.
Did you say, Mike, did you? So for me, I would say the common mistakes that I see are sort of replicating what your friend wants to do. So you put together the same team that your friend who just bought an aircraft purchased, and as a result, maybe your friend has a different personality, maybe they have a different aircraft type that they needed. And so it shouldn't be assembling the same team as somebody else, but really making sure you put together the right team to support what your buying needs are. And I would also say, a lot of the things we've talked about today can be done in advance. So your tax plan and your ownership structure can actually be done before you even find the right plane that you fall in love with. So that way, when you do find the perfect aircraft, you're a prepared buyer who can move right away and make an offer right away, without having to think about, well, will I really qualify for bonus depreciation? Or what are the state sales tax consequences? Or what about my property tax? So if you've done all of that thought in advance and put your team together in advance, then the buying process can be so much easier and less stressful, because you're not sort of immediately having to think about 100 different things. You've already thought about a lot of the things in advance, and you can just focus on the fun part, which is finding the perfect aircraft for yourself.
That's great, thanks. Deborah?
Yeah, so I mean, the most common mistake is focusing only on the purchase price. That's where there's a much larger picture going on than just the purchase price. But to Amanda's point, not being willing to engage good expertise early means that you're going to run into potential pitfalls that aren't identified usually until the last minute, and they're not avoided in that. So for instance, recently there are a number of pre-buys that seem to be falling apart midway, and that's costly both in dollars but also in company energy, and can be avoided if you follow and bring in Amanda early, bring in the insurance people early, bring in the management company, and then just time that and sequence that so that you get the best outcome in the deal.
Great advice, thank you. Amanda, Deborah, thank you very much for spending time with us and sharing your insights. Attendees, I'd like to thank you as well for participating, and we'll now turn to attendee Q&A. Thank you very much. We'll give Amanda and Deborah just a moment to come back and join us, and we'll go through the Q&A. Welcome to this VBACE education session, Buying a Private. Deborah's turning her video camera back on. She'll be with us shortly. There she is. Hello, Deborah. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. Really appreciated your comments. Did generate a good number of questions that are in the Q&A. So what we'll do is go through the questions that came in. There's an option for people to vote up questions that they thought were the questions that were most relevant to them. So we'll take them in that order. The first one, Amanda, this is for you. Could you provide some detail about splitting the cost of an aircraft with another person, not fractional ownership, but a joint ownership 50-50 cost? And the person also commented, for anyone reading, Amanda has worked with this person who asked the questions company on their aircraft purchase, and she was a great asset. So
that's great. So yeah, there's actually two really good ways to do it. You can either do a co-ownership or a joint ownership between two people, and the difference there is you could have one primary person who's responsible for hiring the crew. Under joint ownership, co-ownership, you both source it. But it's a great way to help you share cost. And both entities can be registered as co-owners on the FAA registry. And importantly, both entities can take whatever tax benefits they get from their 50% ownership of the aircraft. And so the most important thing is to go into it knowing that there would be potential conflicts when you both want to use the plane, for example, the day after Thanksgiving. So I always recommend a co-ownership or a joint ownership agreement be written between the parties, and you really go into detail how the scheduling is going to work, whether it's going to be, first come, first serve, or maybe you're going to have like a draft like you would for fantasy football and pull the most important dates in December for the future year. And also go into detail on cost and any upgrades you're going to want to do to the aircraft in the future and how you get agreement on those. But I think it's a great way, if you don't want to necessarily charter your aircraft to help offset fixed cost, having somebody go in with you on the acquisition is a good way, as long as you do it right in advance. I think it can really be a useful tool for people to use.
Great, thank you very much. Second question for you, Deborah. Somebody's wondering about the status of the airplane market, the used aircraft market in particular. Is it stronger than new aircraft sales, particularly in the small and mid-sized cabin segment? And how would you factor in pricing between the new and the used markets?
Certainly the used market is very, very strong. The new aircraft, I think after August, they've seen quite an uptick, at least from what we have seen. But generally, it depends on the airplane model. There are, in certain types of airplanes, there's a lot of inventory out there, and there's a lot to pick from. In some of the other models, especially in the, say, $3 million, $5 million market, and then approximately $10 million market, we're seeing just a number of airplanes going into pre-buy right at this time. So I think it's much stronger, certainly, than it was, and people are attributing that to COVID. But also, people were coming at the year end, so we have that last month of the quarter.
Great, thanks. Next question, do you find that most Part 91 owner-operated aircraft are owned under their own unique LLC structure, separate from the main company's LLC or corporation? Amanda, if you could talk about that in the flight department company dilemma.
Yeah, I think part of it really goes into the ownership structure planning for the aircraft. So in some particular states, you need to set up a sole purpose entity and then lease it to your operating company to have a sale for resale structure to avoid having to pay sales or use tax on the full purchase price of the aircraft. So sometimes that structure is driven by the tax in the particular state where the aircraft is going to be based. Some people also do it for liability reasons. I don't think and I think also some people do it just because it makes sense to try to protect yourself from a liability standpoint, because it's a piece of equipment with a million moving parts flying around in the sky. But you want to be careful that whoever sets up that understands that while a sole purpose LLC can own the plane, it cannot operate the plane under Part 91. So you'd have to somehow move the operational control out of that sole purpose LLC into your operating entity.
Okay, thank you very much. And then that relates to another question that came in about really getting to the heart of illegal charter and what an owner can and cannot do with regard to sharing of costs, letting friends use the aircraft. And if you really need that type of revenue, is it better to put the aircraft on a 135 certificate?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in general, right, under Part 91, there can be no compensation for hire. There are exceptions under 91-501, right? And those exceptions are dry leases, timeshare agreements, parent-child company relationships. And there's a few others, but it's certainly not the case where if you're owning an aircraft, you should put a bulletin board and an FBO saying, let me know if you want to use my plane and list a price, right? That would not be okay. There are some limited ways you can do it, but most of them require something in writing, something on board the aircraft, and notification to the FAA that you're doing the truth in the leasing and you filed the truth in leasing provisions. So my short answer is, if you're wanting to do this often to a lot of different people, put it on a 135 certificate. If it's one or maybe two people that are truly related and are going to really source their own aircraft or own crew, then you could get a dry lease, and then there's timeshare as well. But generally, I think you want to really just make sure you've got somebody who can look at what you're trying to do, and whatever it is you're trying to do, implement it in a way that doesn't violate the regulations.
Thank you very much. And maybe Cliff Notes version answer to this question, because it can get relatively complex. What are the benefits to leasing versus buying outright? Taxes, depreciation, et cetera. Amanda, if you can start, and then Deborah, maybe share some thoughts from the buyer's perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, it really just goes to whether you want the asset on your books or off the books, right? So if you want to own it and get the whatever the sales or whatever the tax benefits and are for owning that aircraft, whether you get bonus depreciation or whatever, then you own it. If you want to keep it off your balance sheet and just pay a lease fee to somebody else who maybe can use the depreciation that you can't, then you want to lease the aircraft. High level. Thanks.
Deborah, other thoughts on that from a buyer?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they can all look the same, or they can look separate, to Amanda's point. There's vehicles for the tax lease, that's still a lease, and there's a vehicle for just an operating lease. So either works depending on where you see it and what you want the optics to be.
Great, thanks. A couple questions on insurance. It is a big ticket item when purchasing an aircraft. Certainly we've seen some changes in the insurance market in the last couple of years. Question first, how do we select the right insurance partner? And then second, when do you bring the insurance person in? We talked about the insurance person being a critical part of the team.
Right. So I'll pick that up. You want to make sure they have the expertise that you're looking for. So if you spend a few minutes and look at what it is that's important to you, and then share that with them, that'll go a long way. But how you pick them, you want to make sure that not only do they have the expertise, but are they asking you the right questions? And do you get the impression, and when you interview them, do they have the right relationships with the underwriters, for your type of operation? Because if you think of it, they're going to go make a picture for you, on your behalf, and you want that picture to be as positive as possible with the underwriter.
I would just add that you want to make sure that whoever is going to source the insurance for you understands the aviation market and specific to that type of aircraft that you're purchasing. So there's, I have go-to people for large cabin planes, and then I have go-to people for piston aircraft. So it really depends on what type of plane is being acquired.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Do you think the pandemic is changing what customers value in an aircraft? For example, do they want more cabin space? Do flight departments want more seats to accommodate more people? Comment about more or less range, speed, et cetera. What are the factors that you're seeing, Deborah, with buyer needs today?
Yeah. So, again, it's back to, the culture of the particular company. I mean, some feel like size matters and matters a lot. Others who are especially looking in the smaller airplanes where they may not have that size, they're looking to their protocols in-house. Are they taking temperatures? Are they doing the things already that would make them feel comfortable, in a smaller cabin? So you have both. You really do.
I think too, the pandemic has changed it, where you had a lot of people who were maybe flying some private flights and some commercial flights, depending on where they were going and how expensive it was. And maybe they were using commercial flights for international travel. And I think people have decided in large part to fly exclusively private if they can. And as a result, I have clients who maybe had an aircraft that couldn't make it comfortably to Europe or to somewhere else, and they have traded their, smaller aircraft for something bigger because they're going to be flying longer flights privately now and going forward.
Definitely more control across the board, and that's important.
Yeah, I think control is really one of the key reasons why people are coming to business aviation, new entrants in particular. How does one figure out what to look for in a pre-buy? Deborah, if we could start with you.
Yeah, so, in a pre-buy, you really want to make sure that you view all three components, which is the airplane itself, the engines, and the records that support both of those. Right. So generally, the inspection should be aligned to your risk tolerance. What is it that you want to know about the airplane, and then that inspection reflects that. The engines, you can look at the visual side, which is really for FOD or foreign object damage, or you can go deeper and kind of look and see what's happening. Are there any trends or anything that might come up later? And we call those boroscopes. And you can weigh whether or not you need one or the other based upon whether or not you have a warranty type program, like a power by the hour, et cetera. And then you want to look at the records. That reflects a value, and that really bifurcates in, do you just need what the regulations require? And that's fine, and you're going to have it on a 135 certificate, so you want to make sure it meets their requirements. Or do you want to look at these records as you need to manage that asset going forward? So you can look at it either way. But if you look at all three, you will have a much better picture of how you want to go back to Amanda and have that contract written, right? Because she will have some of that definition written in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think too, you want to look at what's recently been done to the aircraft. If it just had a major inspection, then you don't need to do everything you would necessarily do if it hadn't had that recent inspection. So looking at what just happened to the aircraft in, say, the last 6-12 months is important, and just defining the scope of the inspection.
Yeah. Amanda, you talked a little bit earlier when we talked about rules of thumb that there's an emotional component with the aircraft. Can you talk about the emotion and when it's time to walk away if things don't go well in a pre-buy, and how that there is a concern if you get emotionally attached to a particular serial number?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to have the right team member who is the technical expert right then and there, right? Because in a lot of my clients' mind, they're already the owner of the plane, and they're already planning the first flight on a particular day, sometimes when the aircraft is in pre-buy. And then when something significant is found, you really need to rely on the technical person to articulate what that finding means for the future value of the aircraft and the safety of that aircraft going forward. And then the different remedies that have been proposed to fix those, are those going to put everybody at ease that you can still move forward? But certainly, when you find significant, foreign object damage in engines that aren't on programs, that's an issue. And even if it is on program, it means the engine comes off, it goes to the shop, it won't be back for a few months. All of those things, can pop up unexpectedly, and you really just need to set the expectations that there would be another aircraft out there that could be found if this isn't the right one to buy now.
Great, thanks. And then I think the final question we have time for today in the Voted Up is, are there any special considerations for prospective U.S. registered aircraft owners who are not U.S. persons?
Yeah, so in the US, we have an owner registry system where the owner of the aircraft takes title of the aircraft and they're the registered owner. Some other countries have operator registrations, but in the US, we have an owner registry. And the owner has to be a US citizen in order to own the aircraft. And there are specific requirements for each entity type. So, for example, a partnership, if any of the partners aren't human beings that you can touch, that partnership's going to fail the citizenship test, which seems counterintuitive because if one of the partners is a US corporation, you would think that that would meet the citizenship requirements, but it doesn't. And as a result, you can put the aircraft into an owner trust. There are several companies out there that offer that product, and they will be the owner of the aircraft and then lease it to the operating entity. So there are ways to get around that. But again, you've got to have the right team together to figure out how to make sure you get it registered correctly and legally.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we're out of time today for questions. There are a couple other that came in, so we'll try to get the answers back to those who asked the questions. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Deborah, for your expertise and sharing this. And thank you to the attendees for participating. Enjoy the rest of VBACE.